I'm sure many of us are starting to get tired of seeing so much discussion regarding master modes. Hello everybody, this is Odd Job Entertainment bringing you another video, and yes, this one's about master modes too. I think my opinion was stated well in my last video. There's still so much we don't know about master modes, and so I don't see the value in dramatic changes at this point. Today, I want to look at two overarching ideas, why we need something like master modes, and going into the specifics about all the remaining unknowns. This will in part feel like a rehashing of my last video. I've had much more time in Arena Commander and started to actually contribute to my team. I feel like I have a better understanding than before and can offer more detailed insight. I also want to say that yes, I know snubs don't have a quantum drive, and that is why they don't get a speed boost. I can read, I did read that before, but it's a dumb reason. The limitations of nav mode versus SCM mode are just as easily explained as a factor of power plant power being split between different subsystems in SCM mode, and that's why you go faster in nav mode. It's a game with spaceships. The lore is whatever it needs to be. If I get another comment saying snubs don't have a quantum drive, I'm going to lose it. This being the internet though, do your thing I guess. Anyway, on to the video. First off, what is master modes and why do we need it? The major change that comes with master modes is that the speeds while in combat have been brought down dramatically. But the real core of master modes is an attempt to lower the barrier to entry for new and inexperienced players. Full stop. Much of the player base in Star Citizen has been here for a long time, but with each free fly event we pull in some more new players. There is one thing on the horizon though that seeks to bring in a lot more than ever before, and that is Squadron 42. Squadron 42 is the single-player campaign accompaniment of Star Citizen. It will represent for many people their first taste of the Star Citizen universe. It is also the pinnacle of the cinematic type of experience you can get in this game. On screen, you can see select scenes from the most recent CitizenCon. I've picked these scenes for the type of aerobatic maneuvers shown. I want you to think really hard to your first time playing this game. Not knowing the controls, barely able to control your ship. Could you pull this off with the model we have in live right now? I know if I'm honest with myself, the answer is no. Could I probably do it now? Yeah, probably. But that's with hours and hours of practice. Practice that I would not have had if the campaign is my first experience with Star Citizen. And that is what most players are going to have. So consider the millions of players that Squadron 42 aims to bring into the community through the campaign. All of those players need an experience that is both cinematic while still being challenging. But if it is too difficult, those players don't finish the campaign, and Reddit fills up with posts about how broken the campaign is, and then CIG loses out on fortunes. Our game, as a result, doesn't do well either. The main problem Star Citizen has always had is how to onboard new players and teach them the requisite skills for playing the game. The campaign does just that. It sets the stage for how you should expect to play the game and gets you immersed in the world around you. If Squadron 42 were to release with the model currently in the game, it would not be a good experience for those players. We need to lower the barrier to entry if we want this game to be successful, period. Let's look at a graph of player skill in PvP compared to the total population. You typically expect to see a bell curve distribution of skill in a game. But with PvP in Star Citizen, I expect that we would see something that more closely resembles this kind of skew, where the top PvP players are a very limited number of players at the higher levels, with the vast majority of players being less than average. That is to say, they are less than average because the minimum skill required is prohibitively high and results in most players skipping PvP altogether. So you may be wondering where I found such a graph. Well, once upon a time, OkCupid, a dating site, conducted a study with their members to compare how their users rated members of the opposite sex. They found that the males' ratings of women resulted in the expected bell curve. The women's rating of men resulted in more than 80% of men being rated as unattractive. This is the same kind of gatekeepy attitude reflected in the idea that you should have to train for PvP as though it is a job, ignoring the fact that most people just like to play games and don't want a second job when they get home. Couple that with the fact that most players are expected to, yes, find a niche to focus on, but also expect to dabble in all aspects of the game. It should not require career levels of focus to play a game. And those of you that have played Arena Commander already know this. You see the same names in every match. You all know each other. So there's not enough players to keep PvP alive. You should be able to be competent at any skill with minimal time, with the freedom to then master it down the road. Right now, we have a game that is both difficult to master and difficult to start. And that is a problem. Master Mode seeks to rectify all of this by making the game digestible to the average human. And that's a good thing, because the whales that have funded the game are surely starting to run out of money. And without major influxes of new players, Star Citizen will likely not maintain a critical mass of profitability for the indefinite future. Master Modes does this very well, but players complain that it seemingly also brings the skill ceiling down too. Why can't we have higher SCM speeds? Why is there no room for flexibility? And again, Squadron 42 is a big component here. If the speeds of projectiles, missiles, and targets are all tuned to the lower speed of Master Modes, then you simply can't have higher speeds available to players, as they'd be able to skip most of the campaign by virtue of that speed. Suppose that you're supposed to go into battle against the Vanduul Swarm. If you can speed your way out of any conflict, all the complexity of shield management, countermeasures, weapons, etc. goes out the window. At the end of the day, you can just zoom out of the fray and recharge. If the size of the environments, the obstacles, and the physical space is tuned to these lower speeds, you can't have players going faster than that. Now the question is, why does Squadron 42 have such an influence over the PU? I know a lot of people view them as separate games, but from my perspective, Squadron 42 and Star Citizen have always been extensions of each other, much the same way as the multiplayer experience in Call of Duty mirrors that of the campaign. The technology of Squadron 42 carries over into Star Citizen and vice versa. They are intrinsically linked. You could make the argument, though, that the PU could have separate tuning from Squadron 42, and it likely will. But if the campaign represents the scope, style, and type of experience they are trying to make, there cannot be large deviations in the tuning in the PU for all the same reasons. Eventually, there will be integrated story experiences in the persistent universe. Missions that chain together, periodic story updates, questlines, all of that is going to be in the PU. All of those then need to be balanced and tuned to provide a good experience for players. Again, if you can always just zoom out of a hairy situation, how does a developer capture you in an experience? The high speeds we have currently in combat are like a skip dialogue button for reality itself. Another reason we need master modes or some similar system is to end the light fighter meta. Here are all the ships currently announced for Star Citizen. There's over 200 at this point. And here are all the ships worth using in PvP. Notice anything? That's right, they're all light fighters. In fact, you could even argue that there's really only 2 ships worth using in PvP, the Gladius and the Arrow. They're cheap, easy to get, and everybody seems to use them. Today, in live, you can take a single pilot in an Arrow against a fully crewed Hammerhead and kite the Hammerhead forever until it blows up. If the Hammerhead manages to get the Arrow's shields down, it can just retreat and come back. If you win against a pilot that knows what they're doing, it's because they made a mistake. So should a single pilot have the win against 7 players in a dedicated anti-fighter subcapital ship? No, obviously not. The Arrow should be the one in this scenario that runs off in fear. You should be picking the Gladius and the Arrow if you're doing combat alone and against the right targets. But if you're able to pull in a friend, it should make sense that something like the Scorpius or the Vanguard gives you an advantage. Currently, it makes more sense to just have 2 Arrows or 2 Gladii. And that's not a good balance. This is the same idea behind Buzzcut's video saying that 1 + 1 = 3. We've always been sold the idea that ships would have roles and purpose, that you wouldn't be able to do everything with a single ship. We have the variety, but we don't have the dedicated roles and specialization. But Objob, I'm an ace pilot. I should be able to take on bigger threats. Absolutely. This graphic shows what I believe to be representative of the ideal scenario as it relates skill to ship class. As you can see with the standard deviation, there is an overlap between each class and even across several classes. If an ace pilot in an arrow goes up against a heavy fighter, you should be able to use your improved speed and agility to get out on top. But if the skill across both ships are equally matched, it should be difficult to determine the winner. If the better team is in the heavy fighter, they should be getting the win. Right now, we tend to think of this kind of scenario as though it were a 1v1 because there's one ship on either side, right? But it's not. It's a 1v2. You have a pilot and a co-pilot in the heavy fighter. So just like any other game, the better coordinated team should be getting the win. And I've seen some players argue that this makes the fight a pay-to-win. That's not true. All ships are or will be available in-game. It's no more a pay-to-win than a 1v2 is a pay-to-win in Battlefield, Call of Duty, or literally any other game. Regardless of what game you're playing, if two players are communicating and coordinating together, they should be winning against the single opponent. And in fact, I'd go so far as to even say that if any other case is true, that is what would be a pay-to-win scenario. If you're able to buy a ship that most people don't have access to, and as a single pilot take out ships much bigger than your ship class, that ship has become a pay-to-win. You should not have an unfair advantage over numerous players by virtue of being an ace pilot in a single seat ship. Okay, how about two arrows versus a single vanguard? Now it's a 2v2, right? Well, again, we look at the total skill across both teams. If you have an ace and me against a well-crewed vanguard, I'll quickly be shot down and then it's just a 1v2 again. But if you have two aces against a mediocre team in a vanguard, that could be an easy win. But if the teams are equally matched in skill, it's going to be a very tough fight. I think the logic here is self-evident. This part should not be getting people steamed. This is pretty plain, and I don't think anyone would argue that a single ace pilot should be taking down a well-crewed vanguard. So now, here's the problem. If this was the ideal breakdown for skill and ship class, then this is the reality. Just as we already outlined, you can take a single arrow against a fully crewed hammerhead and still win. A single ace can currently do way more than they should be able to. It reduces any incentive to use alternative ships to be negligible, and it makes the multi-crew experience a joke. But that hammerhead also hints at yet another reason why this rebalance has been so desperately needed. Combat in Star Citizen goes so far beyond 1v1s and 1v2s. We are working towards a universe that will have everything from snubs to capital ships, all in the same play space. We are supposed to have hammerheads defending other larger ships as a fighter screen. There are supposed to be javelins deploying said fighters and Idrisai shooting at the javelin. Master Modes is laying the foundation for all of these classes of ships to coexist on a battlefield and have clear roles for how they are to engage the enemy. A great example of this idea in action is the gameplay being shown here from Virgil. He's picking and choosing his targets according to how he can best help his team. In this particular section, he's distracting a heavy fighter and wasting its time while waiting for his next target to spawn in. This is the kind of dynamic CIG is working towards. You should look at a battlefield and see a variety of ships, and you'll engage the ones best suited for your ship. You'll need to evade other classes designed to take you out and stay moving within the densely packed chaos that surrounds you. I think we've laid out the various needs for Master Modes here. I want to address, if briefly, the concerns of some in the PvP community. In the very worst case scenario, Master Modes tuning reverts all the speed changes and we essentially get a toggle for combat and nav mode. If this is what would satisfy the PvP community, then I think we understand how to make those people happy. But consider that being skilled in Master Modes may mean something different than it does in the current model. Master Modes does de-emphasize to a degree the role of single ace pilots, but that doesn't mean you are less valuable as a pilot. Having a cadre of ace pilots in a fighter wing is necessary for larger engagements. Finding your stride as part of a team, communicating with your comrades, and coordinating assaults will be new ways to shine. For individual pilot skill, however, there is still a lot to uncover with Master Modes that we simply do not have access to as of yet. And it's here that I want to transition to talking about the many things we are still missing from Master Modes and how that impacts this point of contention. Keep in mind that while we are only just now getting our hands on part of Master Modes, it has been in development for significantly longer. Much of the Squadron 42 campaign has been formed around these speeds and the experience provided. So while it may feel that it's been thrust upon us all of a sudden, it's been behind the scenes for quite some time now. Back to the limited number of ships currently available, these are the ships we have in Master Modes: Merlin, Gladius, Buccaneer, Super Hornet, Vanguard, Constellation, Hammerhead. Alright? Okay, now these are the ships that are going to be in the PU. Making judgments on Master Modes without all these ships in place is like navigating a forest with only a candle. How much of a variance will we eventually see across an archetype? There is so much on the horizon yet to discover that it's comical to think we actually understand Master Modes right now. How do all the combat ships interact with ships of industry? Do these ships now have a viable escape route? Will a prospector be in nav mode or SCM mode while mining? If I'm flying the Constellation and I'm in nav mode, how does a combat ship intercept me? Will a Mantis be required and therefore actually useful for engaging piracy? How does E-Warfare tie in? Does it disable nav mode? What about all the other damage types we don't have yet, even in the PU, such as Flak, Incendiary, Disarray, and Plasma? In my last video, some people scoffed at the mention of armor. Armor might make some ships off the menu entirely to other ships. We don't have it yet, and we don't know what effect it will have. I also mentioned precision mode in that last video, and this is a big part of Master Modes. It could fix a lot of the issues currently existing with multi-crew and the weakness of turrets to do any real damage to targets. It also has a direct link to how much DPS you can deal, as using gimbals will lower your output for pilot weapons, turrets get no penalty from gimbals, and sub-targeting could introduce much more variation into how a ship is crippled and taken down. If you're in an Ares, for instance, you may find yourself using precision mode to take on larger targets from a distance. It would then be necessary to send a squadron of fighters to take out those Ares to protect an Idris, and it would likewise be necessary to protect your Ares with fighters of your own. I also want to point out, besides the very limited number of ships we have available, we have the additional limitation of only having one loadout for said ships as well. All these ships are currently sporting laser repeaters and Gatling guns, and the Vanguard has the only ballistic cannon. Just with what is already in-game, we've got the entire branch of distortion weapons, including scatterguns, repeaters, and cannons. We've got all the rest of the laser repeaters, ballistic Gatlings, cannons of both types, repeaters, scatterguns. There's also all the other missile varieties and the components that have yet to be tested, from shields, power plants, coolers, quantum drives, etc. Consider just quantum drives, for instance. Does changing your quantum drive affect how quickly you can transition from nav to SCM and vice versa? An interceptor in that case might want to have the faster swap drive so that they can head off targets and re-engage, but that could come with a number of penalties like range, top quantum speed, and many others. All of this is especially relevant considering that much of this consideration has likely been taken for Squadron 42 already. We've essentially been testing movement only, without access to everything else that is also part of Master Modes. It should be clear, with all of this still on the horizon, there is plenty of room even within Master Modes to prove your skill and advance. Top skill may have a different meaning, but that does not mean there isn't room for growth. To recap, there are a lot of potential benefits from Master Modes. Even if it fails at some point, we need something to lower the skill barrier for the millions of players yet to join the verse. I've listened to a lot of proposed alternatives, but they do not address the root problem. We currently have too much speed for engagements. It's difficult, if not impossible, to balance the game around such speeds, and the alternatives do not truly make the experience better for newer players. Additionally, there is still so much testing to be done in the wider context of Master Modes that it is frankly silly to be throwing our hands up already. With all of this still remaining to be seen, the best course of action is really just to wait and see.